Hello, Zero Books readers. It's me again, Douglas Lane. And in this video, I'll be talking about capitalist realism and class reductionism. If you enjoy these videos, you should consider supporting us on Patreon. We're just about to introduce a new patron-only podcast series, actually two of them. The first one is going to be entitled Television and Theory, and I'm doing that one every couple of weeks with my daughter, Emma. We're reading Rosa Luxemburg's Reform or Revolution, and we're watching the television show Schitt's Creek. We're seeing if those two things interact at all. And then the second podcast series that I'm starting is with my son Benjamin, and that is going to be called Cinema and Communism, and we'll be looking at the Coen brothers pictures. And the first one we'll be doing is A Serious Man, and at the same time we'll be reading this. We'll be reading From Crisis to Communization by Gilles Dauvé. So it's a good time to support us on Patreon. You'll be getting access to two entirely secret podcasts. No one else will be able to hear, except for people who give us $5 a month. So this is my way of both being fully enmeshed in nepotism and exploiting my own children. So help us out with that. Karl Marx was a class reductionist. That is, for Marx, the ultimate cause of our social ills, the reason that, for instance, African slaves were introduced to America, or that one nation would subjugate another, or that religious dogmatism might take hold of a people, was always ultimately to be found in the material forces giving shape to society and its values. As Engels said at Marx's grave in 1883, Karl Marx discovered the law of development of human history. The simple fact, hitherto concealed by an overgrowth of ideology, that mankind must first of all eat, drink, have shelter and clothing before it can pursue politics, science, art, religion, and so on. Since the 19th century, as capitalism has taken hold of more and more territory, peoples, and aspects of life, this truth has become more and more obscure. In his 2009 book, Capitalist Realism, Mark Fisher started by noting that it is easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. One of the reasons for this is that most people no longer have a clear conception of what capitalism is or how it functions. Many have a very confused conception of class. Even those who see themselves as mounting a working class politics sometimes consider the cultural effects of class society as if these explain the class system itself.
Why do the majority of the population, allow themselves to be exploited? Why do the majority of the population, and not move into a position of owning the means of production or whatever? And I think then we have to talk about subordination as an issue with class, and subordination then people experiencing themselves as inferior. And I think this is the key thing, and this is why I think class provides the key to deliberalizing race and gender.
According to Marx, a class is a social relationship rather than a position or rank. In an essay by Bertil Ohlmann entitled Marx's Use of Class, Ullman noted that the task of figuring out just who is or is not working class isn't always easy, both because a person's relationship to the mode of production can change, and because, for Marx, there were two ways to frame the question. The first way to understand class is in relation to the mode of production, and the second is in relation to the struggle for socialism. So, for instance, a police officer or a newspaper reporter might be technically proletariat because they rent their labor time in exchange for a wage. But they might both be considered bourgeois in the context of a political struggle. What Marx did not do is consider the working class as a cultural identity. There can never be a working class war for national independence, for example. And it's with this conception of class in mind, that is, with the understanding that the class system is a set of social relations that produce our society's institutions and culture, while the class struggle is a political project aimed at changing the foundation of society, that we can take up Tatiana Cozzarelli's essay for the publication Left Voice, entitled Class Reductionism Is Real. Cozzarelli begins her essay by asserting that some factions within the DSA are alienating the new black-led movement in the streets by embracing Bernie Sanders and by reducing the issue of systemic racism to a merely economic issue. She calls this tendency to reduce the problem of racism to an economic issue class reductionism. But she underestimates the extent to which the struggle for socialism, based on Marx's understanding, is reductive and has to be. For a Marxist, there is no meaningful way to compare class relations to relations based on race, gender, or sexual orientation, and there's even less of a reason to compare class to any particular identity. Cozzarelli defines class reductionism this way. Class reductionism is the belief that class causes all oppression, and in turn, that economic changes are enough to resolve all forms of oppression. Now, the Marxist conception of class usually does not aim at explaining oppression at all, let alone at explaining every oppression in society. While the Enlightenment tradition was aimed at overcoming the oppressive categories of tradition, Marx explicitly critiqued those socialists who conceived of the struggle for socialism in terms of fairness or justice, not because he rejected their sense of fairness or rightness, but because he saw these moral principles arising from a material foundation. This isn't to say that Marx was unconcerned with oppression or with breaking from traditional values, say those values that justified inequality. In fact, he saw capitalism as a progressive force precisely because it so efficiently laid waste to those traditions and attitudes. Still, for Marx, the aim of the socialist struggle was to achieve freedom and self-responsibility for the mass of mankind, which meant that the fact that our material relations are shaped by our productive social relations, currently our class relations, would have to be both understood and overcome. Amazingly, Cozzarelli accuses those she calls class reductionists of breaking with Marx. She claims that Marx wrote about the oppression of women in the Communist Manifesto without, quote, reducing their struggle to, quote, just a question of class. But anyone who has read the manifesto would know that Marx very precisely reduces the struggle of women to a question of class. In the section wherein Marx writes in favor of the socialist abolition of prostitution, both private and public, he insists that this abolition will come about not through legal reforms, but through the abolition of the system of production from which prostitutes and bourgeois marriages spring. And in this same manifesto, Marxism praises capitalism for destroying patriarchal authority, claiming that the difference of age and sex have no longer any distinctive social validity for the working class. Attempting to enlist Lenin to her side, Cozzarelli claims that What Is to Be Done is a document that railed against class reductionism as it discouraged socialists from focusing on narrow economic demands. But when Lenin spoke of economism and what is to be done, he was not abandoning the aim of transcending the class system, but instead railing against those who would look to the streets and to the strikers to lead, rather than to a revolutionary vanguard party. Lenin opposed those who favored tailing behind workers who he thought would never surpass trade union consciousness. That is, they would never be concerned with more than their immediate interests as workers, when the true aim of the revolution should be to eliminate class distinctions altogether. The economistic socialists today are those who argue against the need for the abolition of class society and who believe that socialism can be achieved through the expansion of rights, through redistribution, and through reforms. Not content to drop the names of Marx and Lenin, Cozzarelli mentions Leon Trotsky, James Cannon, and C.L.R. James. However, Trotsky's interests in the black struggle and his correspondences with James Cannon and C.L.R. James should not spare him from the charge of class reductionism. That is, if being a class reductionist means you believe that overcoming class society is the ultimate aim of socialism, and that overcoming class will ultimately undo racism, then not only is Trotsky a class reductionist, but so are C.L.R. James and Cannon. After all, James, the author of The Black Jacobins and the advocate for black workers as a new American vanguard, advised Trotsky not to prioritize the Black Belt Project for African American self-determination because it would not advance the social revolution. In other words, James did not believe that in the context of early 20th century America, black nationalism would bring the movement any closer to overcoming class relations. Cozzarelli is appalled that writers for Jacobin and members within the DSA would advocate for class-wide demands or even race-blind demands. However, their advocacy for the development of such demands is utterly normal for a functioning socialist movement that aims to ultimately unite the working class. The question of which demands we should prioritize in this moment is different from the question of whether we should have class-wide demands or race-blind demands. It's a different question. The transitional demands from the working class, say for a shorter work week, for full employment, for a universal living wage, would also tremendously benefit working class black people. The question of whether we must first fight for the rights and the needs of the most oppressed sectors of the working class before we make these broader demands, whether we should run simultaneous campaigns, or whether we should fight for the American working class as a whole right now, is again a tactical and not a moral question, and the only way we'll be able to settle it is by recalling that our ultimate aim is to reduce the role that the class system plays in our society to zero. Thanks for watching this Zero Books video. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to this channel and click on the notifications bell so that you'll be alerted whenever we release a new video. You should also consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons get access to our Inside Zero Books podcast every week and can get access to the Zero Books Book Club and help us to continue making online content from the left.